I never thought that one evening could destroy everything I thought was stable in my life. But that's exactly what happened the night I spent with my husband's boss. At 58, I had settled into what I assumed was the final version of my life. Comfortable, predictable, a marriage that resembled more of a companionship than a romance. Days filled with gardening, grocery runs, and tidying up a home that no longer felt full. Nights with Mark, my husband of 33 years, usually ended in silence, each of us retreating to our own distractions before bed. I didn't resent him. I didn't really feel much of anything. Mark had always been reliable, steady. He built his career slowly, methodically, and now, nearing retirement, he was still respected by those around him, especially by his boss, Thomas. I had met Thomas a few times before, always in passing at office gatherings or charity functions. He was the kind of man who made others stand a little straighter when he entered the room. Not because he was imposing, but because he carried a calm authority that demanded attention without ever asking for it. That evening, Mark invited me to his firm's annual appreciation dinner, something I normally avoided. But for reasons I still don't understand, I agreed. Maybe it was the way he asked, gently, like he knew I needed something different. Or maybe it was because I had begun to feel like a ghost in my own home. The venue was elegant but understated. Linen-covered tables, warm lighting, soft jazz playing beneath the low hum of polite conversation. Mark was swept into a circle of coworkers almost immediately. I stood beside him for a few moments, smiling politely, until I quietly stepped away and found an empty seat near the corner of the room. That's where Thomas found me. He didn't say much at first, just a nod. Then he sat beside me without asking. I remember the weight of the silence that followed, not uncomfortable, just full, like something unspoken hovered in the space between us. Finally he said, "You seem far away." I turned to look at him, caught off guard. He wasn't smiling, but there was a softness in his expression that made the words feel less like a question and more like an observation. "I guess I've been feeling that way lately," I said, surprising myself. He nodded slowly. Sometimes the world moves around us, and we forget to keep moving with it. We talked more after that, about nothing and everything, about retirement plans and gardening, about books we had both read years ago. He listened like the world had stopped spinning, like my words mattered, like I mattered. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me that way. When the dinner ended, Mark barely noticed I had been gone. On the drive home, he spoke about bonus projections and upcoming audits, and I nodded along, but my mind was elsewhere. Still in that quiet corner, the side a man who had seen something in me I had long forgotten was there. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing Thomas's voice in my head. We forget to keep moving with it. And in that still, breathless dark, I wondered, when had I stopped? The following morning felt heavier than usual. Not in the physical sense, but in the quiet way your thoughts cling to your bones after a restless night. I went about my routine, making tea, feeding the cat, straightening the pillows on the living room couch that no one ever sat on but me. Mark was already at his laptop by the time I came into the kitchen. He glanced up briefly to say good morning before diving back into a spreadsheet that seemed more real to him than I did. I watched him for a moment. The man I had shared a life with. His shoulders slightly hunched, his expression focused but tired. He hadn't noticed the new blouse I wore last night. He hadn't asked if I had enjoyed myself. Maybe he thought it didn't matter. Maybe I had let him believe it didn't. I told myself to let it go. There was no use in opening that door. Not when I wasn't sure what I would say if he did look up and ask the right questions. Later that day, while folding laundry, I found myself thinking about Thomas again. Not in a romantic way, at least, not exactly. It was the way he had seen me, had listened, the way he had spoken without trying to fix anything, without rushing to fill the silence. Just presence. Just attention. It was such a simple thing, and yet it lingered like perfume on skin. A few days passed. Nothing changed outwardly, but something had shifted inside me. I started walking in the evenings. At first, I told myself it was for the fresh air, for my health. But deep down, I knew I was hoping to run into him. And one Tuesday, I did. He was coming out of a small bookstore on Main Street, holding a paper bag in one hand and a coffee in the other. He looked surprised to see me, but pleasantly so. "Evelyn," he said, like he had been thinking about me too. We talked for a few minutes. About the weather, about the book he had just picked up. It was nothing important. And yet I walked home with my hands trembling slightly and my heart beating in ways I hadn't felt in years. That night, Mark mentioned a business trip. He would be away for 3 days. I nodded, pretending to care, but in truth, I was grateful for the space. Not to do anything reckless, but just to sit with my thoughts, to breathe without pretending. On the second night of his trip, I found myself staring at the phone, debating, wondering. It was late, but not too late. I sent Thomas a message. "Are you still awake?" The reply came almost immediately. "I am now." I hesitated, then typed, "Would you like some tea?" My hands trembled as I hit send, and somewhere deep in my chest, something stirred that had been asleep for a very long time. I didn't know what I expected when Thomas arrived. Maybe some awkward tension, maybe hesitation. But instead, there was something calm in the way he stepped through my door that evening, like we'd done this 100 times before. He brought nothing with him, not a bottle of wine, not a box of pastries. Just his quiet presence and that steady, thoughtful look I remembered. We moved to the kitchen without saying much. The kettle was already on. I had sent out 2 mugs without thinking, like some part of me had already decided. The steam from the tea swirled between us as we sat across the small kitchen table. Evening light filtered in through the curtains, softening the edges of the room. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt full, warm. "I wasn't sure if you'd say yes," he said finally. "I wasn't sure I would either," I answered, my voice quieter than I intended. We didn't talk about Mark. We didn't talk about lines or rules or what this was or wasn't. Instead, we talked about our mother's cooking, the smell of old libraries, the way autumn always felt like both a beginning and an end. He told me about his late wife, the way she used to hum when she cooked, the quiet that never quite left the house after she passed. And I shared things I hadn't voiced aloud in years, how I felt invisible in my own home, how I sometimes forgot what it felt like to be touched just because. I didn't cry, neither did he. But there was an ache in the room that felt shared. At one point, I got up to refill the teapot, and as I passed him, he reached out, gently brushing his hand against mine. It was the faintest contact, but it rooted me to the floor. "I'm sorry," he said, not pulling back. "Don't be," I whispered, my breath catching. That's all it was, a touch. But it was more intimate than anything I'd felt in years. Not rushed, not taken, just offered. We didn't kiss. We didn't even hug goodbye. When he left, he looked at me for a long moment and simply said, "Thank you." After the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a while, my hand still tingling. I wasn't sure what we were walking toward or what would happen next, but I knew that something had shifted in me that couldn't be undone. Later that night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, my tea long cold. The quiet wasn't as heavy as it used to be. It was thoughtful now, like it carried meaning. For the first time in a very long while, I didn't feel lonely. I felt seen. The days that followed were quiet, but not empty. Something lingered in the air, soft and unspoken, like the trace of perfume on an old sweater. I moved through my routines with a new kind of awareness. Not of the world around me, but of myself. I started taking more time with little things, lighting a candle at breakfast, playing the radio while I folded laundry, sitting outside in the early evening, watching the sky change. I wasn't waiting for anything, and yet Everything felt like waiting. Thomas didn't call, and I didn't message him either. Not because I didn't want to, but because whatever was building between us didn't seem to need urgency. It was growing in the spaces between words, in the memory of that night. In the quiet we had shared, Mark returned from his business trip 2 days later. I met him at the door, helped him with his suitcase. We had dinner together, like always. He told me about the hotel buffet and the terrible coffee in the conference room. I smiled, nodded, asked questions. Nothing seemed different on the surface, but I was different, and I could feel it. That night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling while his breathing slowed into sleep. I wanted to reach out and tell him everything. I wanted him to ask, but neither of those things happened. A week passed. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, I opened the front door and found an envelope on the mat. No name, no handwriting. Just a soft gray envelope with a small pressed flower inside. I opened it and found a note, written in a neat, familiar hand. Some silences speak louder than words. If you ever want to share another one, I'll be in the park, Saturday, 4 p.m. No signature, none was needed. I held the note for a long while before slipping it into the drawer beside my bed. I told myself I wouldn't go, that it was better not to, that seeing him again would complicate something I didn't yet understand. But deep down, I already knew I'd be there. Saturday came with a golden light that made everything look softer. I dressed simply, nothing too careful, but not careless either. A pale sweater, flat shoes, my hair pinned loosely back. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw someone I hadn't seen in a long time, someone quietly alive. The park was nearly empty. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance. The leaves rustled above me as I walked the path lined with benches and wilting roses. And there he was. Thomas sat at the far end of the path, facing the lake. He didn't wave when he saw me. He just smiled. The kind of smile you give when you're relieved, but don't want to show it too much. I sat beside him, close, but not quite touching. We said nothing at first, just watched the water ripple. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Neither was I." Another pause. "I didn't want to assume," he added. "I'm glad you didn't." We sat for nearly an hour, talking about everything except what we both really felt. And yet, it was all there, in our tone, in the way our shoulders angled toward each other, in the way our eyes met and held for just a second too long. As the sky turned amber and the air grew cooler, he turned to me and said, quietly, "You don't have to say anything, Evelyn, but if being near me brings you even a fraction of what it brings me, I'll be here. No expectations, no pressure." And I nodded, because I didn't have the right words yet. But something in me whispered, "You're not alone anymore." In the days that followed, I found myself thinking less in questions and more in moments. Not, what am I doing, or where will this lead? But rather, what do I feel right now? And what do I want to remember about this? The answer was almost always the same, stillness. A soft internal hush that I hadn't felt in years. Thomas didn't reach out after that afternoon in the park, and I didn't expect him to. We'd reached a quiet understanding. It was strange how something so undefined could still feel so certain. He had offered his presence, and I hadn't turned away. That was enough, for now. Mark, meanwhile, remained unchanged, predictable, safe. He continued his routines, his after-dinner news, his brief goodnights. We lived side by side, but rarely face to face, and I began to realize something quietly devastating. I had let our marriage become a placeholder for a life I no longer recognized. One evening, as I was organizing the hallway closet, I came across an old photo album. Our children as toddlers, a family trip to the coast, Mark, years younger, holding my hand on a pier somewhere foggy. I sat on the floor and flipped through the pages, not with nostalgia, but with distance, like looking into a life that belonged to someone else. Someone I loved once, yes, but someone I had grown away from. At night, I asked Mark if he wanted to take a walk with me, just around the neighborhood. He looked surprised, even skeptical, but said yes. We walked mostly in silence, our steps out of sync. He pointed at a neighbor's overgrown lawn, commented on the chill in the air. I smiled politely, but inside, I felt the ache of two people who had forgotten how to talk. When we got home, I lingered on the porch. He went inside, didn't look back. A few nights later, I found myself back in the park. I didn't tell Thomas I was coming. I didn't even know if he'd be there, but he was. Sitting alone again, book in hand. He looked up as I approached, and without a word, he closed the book and slid it beside him. I was hoping, he said. I sat. Closer this time. I don't know what this is, I whispered, but I feel more like myself when I'm around you, and I don't want to lose that. He didn't respond right away. Then he reached over not to take my hand, but to let his rest near mine, just enough to feel the warmth. You don't have to define it, he said. Sometimes naming things too soon makes them smaller. I smiled through the knot in my throat. In the distance, a dog barked. The wind stirred the leaves overhead, and in that soft, ordinary moment, I felt something return to me. Not desire, not escape, but a slow, gentle reclaiming of my own heart. We sat there until the stars came out, not saying much, just breathing in the quiet, just remembering what it felt like to be seen and to see in return. The nights grew cooler as October settled in. I found comfort in the small rituals, tea before bed, a soft shawl over my shoulders, the scent of cinnamon warming the air. But underneath those quiet comforts was a gentle unrest, the sense that change was coming, whether I invited it or not. One morning, Mark asked if I'd be willing to attend a retirement brunch his firm was hosting. Thomas will be there, he added offhandedly, not knowing the effect those words had on me. I nodded. Of course. I spent longer than usual getting ready that day. Not to impress, not even to feel beautiful, but to feel present. I wore a navy dress I hadn't touched in years, simple gold earrings, and a touch of lipstick that felt strangely brave. When I walked into the hotel banquet room beside Mark, I noticed Thomas almost immediately. He was standing by the coffee table, speaking with another colleague, but his eyes found me in an instant. A brief flicker of recognition. Not surprise, not longing, just a quiet acknowledgement that passed between us like a secret. I didn't approach him. I stayed beside Mark, smiling through conversations I barely followed. I wasn't there to create suspicion. I wasn't there for anything, really, except to know how I felt in that moment. And what I felt was clarity. Thomas eventually passed by. He offered Mark a firm handshake, then turned to me with a slight nod. Evelyn, good to see you again. I smiled. And you. That was all. But the way he said my name stayed with me for the rest of the day. That night, I found myself standing in the kitchen long after Mark had gone to bed. I stared at the clock, watched the minutes tick by, felt the stillness wrap around me like a question. Could I keep living like this? Could I keep pretending that being half seen was enough? I picked up the phone, dialed Thomas's number. He answered on the second ring. I saw you today, I said softly. I know. I wanted to tell you something, but there wasn't time. There was a pause. I'm listening. I don't know what's going to happen next, I said, tears welling unexpectedly. But I know I can't go back to feeling invisible. I need something more, even if I'm scared. He didn't respond right away. Then finally, thank you for saying that. The line went quiet again, but this time, it wasn't empty. I'm here, he said. Whatever you decide, I'm here. I ended the call with a strange sense of peace. Not resolution, but readiness. I stood in the dark kitchen, hands still resting on the counter, and let the silence stretch around me. I wasn't sure what I would tell Mark, or when, or how. But I knew this much. My life wasn't over. My story wasn't finished. And for the first time in a long while, I wanted to keep writing it, for me. The following week felt strangely still. Mark noticed I was quieter than usual, but he didn't ask why. And maybe that silence between us said more than either of us wanted to admit. We had grown accustomed to coexisting, sharing a home, but not a rhythm. It had become easier to avoid certain conversations than to face the cracks beneath the surface. But I couldn't avoid them anymore. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I sat across from Mark at the kitchen table. I watched the steam curl from his mug, the soft slump of his shoulders. I took a breath I had been avoiding for months. "Mark," I said gently, "can we talk?" He looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "Of course." I wasn't cruel. I wasn't angry. I just spoke the truth. "I think we've both been pretending for a long time, like we're okay, like nothing's missing." He was quiet, his expression unreadable, but not defensive. "I'm tired of feeling invisible," I continued, my voice trembling. "And I think maybe you are too. We've stopped really seeing each other, and I don't want to live the rest of my life that way." He stared into his coffee, then nodded slowly. I know. That one phrase, soft, steady, shattered something in me. Not in pain, but in release. It was the first honest moment we'd shared in years. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted. "I just know I need space to figure it out, to figure me out." He didn't argue, didn't plead. He only said, "I want you to be okay, whatever that means." I moved into my sister's guest house a week later. Not far, just far enough to breathe. And in that new space, with its creaky floors and garden view, I began to write. Not stories, not journals, just thoughts. Fragments of feelings I hadn't made room for in decades. Some about Mark. Some about Thomas. Most about myself. Thomas didn't rush me. He never asked for more than I was ready to give. But he was there. A quiet presence. A walk on a Sunday afternoon. A letter slipped into my mailbox with a pressed leaf inside. Notes that read, "Thinking of you today," or simply, "Here." We didn't name what we had. We didn't need to. One evening, we sat in the garden behind the guest house, the air thick with the scent of blooming rosemary and fresh soil. I told him about the photograph I'd found, the one of me at 30, laughing, wind in my hair. "I don't remember being that woman," I said quietly. Thomas looked at me for a long moment. "I do." I didn't cry, but something inside me softened. Not into grief, into possibility. It's been 3 months now. Mark and I are still in touch, kind, cautious. There's no bitterness between us, only a shared tenderness for the years we built together, and a mutual understanding that love, in its truest form, sometimes means letting go. Thomas and I are still us, unwritten, unrushed, but real. And me? I'm still learning, still unfolding, but I no longer feel like a ghost in my own life. I feel grounded, awake. Sometimes the most unforgettable turns come not from chaos or drama, but from a single quiet moment, the kind that whispers, "You're not done yet." And I believe that now. I believe I'm just beginning. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and click on the bell, and share your impressions of listening to this story in the comments. Thank you for watching.